Some stories feel like they're torn from the pages of a Hollywood script, but this one is chillingly real. It's a story about how a man's cruelest words, meant to bury his ex-wife, ended up becoming the punchline to the biggest joke in New York society. Marcus Thorne, a man who built his empire on perception, told anyone who would listen that his ex-wife Genevieve was past her prime, a 45-year-old woman too old to date. He basked in the glow of his 20-something girlfriend and the pitying glances thrown his ex-wife's way. He thought he had won, but he forgot one simple rule: the brightest spotlights can cast the darkest shadows. And in just 1 week, his shadow would swallow him whole when Genevieve appeared on the cover of Prestige Quarterly with a man whose name could buy and sell Marcus's entire world. This is the story of how a woman erased by her husband became the most envied woman in the city. The air in the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was thick with the scent of money and tuberose. It was the annual fundraiser for the Children's Literacy Foundation, an event that was less about charity and more about the brutal silent calculus of New York's elite social hierarchy. At the center of one of the most sycophantic circles was Marcus Thorne. At 48, he was a man sculpted by ambition and the finest personal trainers. His real estate empire, Thorne Properties, was a testament to his ruthlessness, and his recent divorce was, in his eyes, another successful acquisition freedom. Hanging on his arm was Kinsley Monroe, a 24-year-old influencer whose primary skill was looking perpetually surprised and delighted. Her laughter was a high tinkling sound that punctuated Marcus's booming pronouncements. "The market's soft, but only for the weak," Marcus declared to a rapt audience of hedge fund managers and their wives. "You have to be bold. You have to shed dead weight." He gave Kinsley's waist a possessive squeeze, a gesture that wasn't lost on anyone. He was talking about business, but everyone knew he was also talking about Genevieve. His divorce from Genevieve Reed, his wife of 20 years, had been finalized 6 months prior. For 2 decades, Genevieve had been the silent partner in his ascent. She was the one who'd charmed the old money families, who'd remembered the names of their children and their favorite charities, who'd turned their stark modernist penthouse into a warm, inviting home where deals were sealed over her perfectly curated dinner parties. She had put her own promising career as an art historian on indefinite hold to build the Thorne empire. Her payment was a summary execution of their marriage delivered on their 20th anniversary. Later in the evening, fueled by vintage champagne and an overinflated sense of self, Marcus was holding court near the silent auction tables. Robert Sinclair, a rival developer, sauntered over, a smirk playing on his lips. "Marcus, good to see you," Robert began, his eyes flicking to Kinsley. "You're looking revitalized." "I am Bob. I cut out the carbs." Marcus chuckled, and his cronies laughed on cue. "And other unnecessary baggage." "Speaking of," Robert lowered his voice conspiratorially, "I saw Genevieve the other day at the Met. She was, well, she was there." The unspoken words hung in the air. She looked drab. She looked lost. She looked old. Marcus's face hardened. The mere mention of her name felt like a stain on his triumphant evening. He wanted the world to see him as a man reborn, not a man who'd simply traded in his wife for a newer model. He needed to control the narrative. "Genevieve," he said, his voice loud enough for several people to turn. He adopted a look of mock pity. "Bless her heart. I wish her the best, I truly do. But let's be honest." He leaned, in his voice a stage whisper that carried across the polished marble. "The woman is 45. She gave me the best years of her life, and I'm grateful." He paused for dramatic effect. "But she's past her expiration date. She's simply too old to be in the dating game now. Who's going to want a woman her age starting over? It's a tragedy, really." The words were a dagger, sharp and precise. A few people winced. Some of the women contemporaries of Genevieve exchanged uncomfortable glances, but the men, they nodded with a grim sort of understanding. Kinsley just giggled, tightening her grip on his arm, her youth a shield against the casual cruelty of his statement. What Marcus didn't notice was the quiet figure standing just behind a large floral arrangement, Penelope Penny Davies, Genevieve's best friend, and a well-connected journalist who had heard every single venomous word. Her eyes narrowed, and she discreetly tapped a note into her phone. Miles away, in a quiet apartment on the Upper West Side that felt more like a library than a home, Genevieve Reed was unaware of the final public nail her ex-husband was hammering into the coffin of her dignity. She was surrounded by books on Renaissance art, the scent of old paper, a comforting balm. The divorce had left her financially secure, but emotionally hollowed out. She had spent 20 years orbiting Marcus, her own light dimmed to make his shine brighter. Now, in the sudden darkness, she felt invisible. Her phone buzzed. It was Penny. "Jen, are you sitting down?" Penny's voice was tight with fury. "I'm always sitting down these days," Genevieve replied with a weak laugh. "What's wrong?" Penny recounted the conversation word for brutal word. Genevieve listened in silence, her hand gripping the armrest of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. Each syllable was a physical blow. Past her expiration date, too old to date. A tragedy. It wasn't just that he had said it was that he had said it with such dismissive, public pity. He hadn't just divorced her, he was trying to erase her, to define her as a relic of his past, a used thing with no future value. When Penny finished, the silence on the line was heavy. "Jen, are you there?" A single tear traced a path down Genevieve's cheek. She wasn't sad. The sadness had been a dull ache for months. This was something new. This was a cold, clarifying rage. "I'm here, Penny," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Thank you for telling me. What are you going to do?" Genevieve looked around her apartment, at the books that were her only companions, at the reflection in the dark window of a woman she barely recognized. Marcus had built his world on perception. He believed he had crafted her public image as a pitiable, forgotten woman. "I'm going to change the narrative," she said, the words feeling like a vow. "He thinks I'm invisible. He's about to find out what happens when a woman has nothing left to lose." She didn't know how. She didn't have a plan. But for the first time, in a very long time, the woman who had been defined by her husband for 2 decades felt the stirrings of the person she used to be, a woman of intellect, passion, and a will of iron that had merely been dormant, not dead. The tragedy wasn't her age. The tragedy was that she had ever believed her worth was tied to him. And that was a mistake she would never make again. The days following Penny's phone call were a blur of quiet fury. Genevieve's rage didn't manifest in shouting or tears, but in a tense, focused energy that vibrated just beneath her skin. The world outside felt hostile. Every time she stepped out of her apartment, she imagined people looking at her with the same pity Marcus had projected. She saw him everywhere, his smug face on the cover of a business magazine in a newsstand, his name on a new luxury condo development she passed on a walk. He was inescapable. Penny, ever the loyal general, tried to rally her. "We need to get you out there, Jen. Let's go to that new cocktail bar in Soho. It's full of artists and writers not those finance ghouls Marcus ran with. And do what Penny Genevieve asked listlessly, turning the pages of a book on the works of Artemisia Gentileschi. Parade myself around like a prize mare, hoping someone notices I'm not quite ready for the glue factory. Stop that. Stop talking like him, Penny scolded gently. His words are poison. Don't drink it. It's hard when he's poured it into the city's water supply. Despite her friend's efforts, Genevieve retreated further into her shell. She felt like a ghost, haunting the life she once had. The divorce settlement had been generous, but the money felt like a severance package for a long, thankless job. What she missed wasn't Marcus, but the sense of purpose, the structure, the feeling of being part of something. Now her days were formless, a vast, empty canvas. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, as she was sorting through old mail, her hand brushed against a thick, cream-colored envelope she had ignored for weeks. It was embossed with the logo of the Devereux Foundation, a private arts organization known for its staggering collection of post-impressionist and modern art. She slit it open with a letter opener, her movements mechanical. It was an invitation, not to a gala or a fundraiser, but to a private symposium, the Patron's Eye, a symposium on private collection and public trust. It was a small exclusive event for curators, academics, and a handful of major patrons. She realized with a jolt that her name was still on their list from her days as a doctoral candidate long before she became Mrs. Marcus Thorne. Her first instinct was to toss it. The thought of walking into a room full of people, of making small talk, was exhausting. She would be an outsider, a relic from a different life. Then her eyes fell on the list of speakers. The keynote address was to be given by Dr. Alistair Finch. The name sent a strange hum through her. Alistair Finch was a legend, but also a ghost. He was a tech billionaire, the architect behind the revolutionary data encryption firm Aegis, a company so powerful and ubiquitous that it ran silently in the background of half the world's digital transactions. But unlike his peers, Finch was pathologically private. He gave no interviews, had no social media presence, and was rarely photographed. His only known public passion was art. He was rumored to possess one of the most significant private art collections in the world, a collection no one had ever really seen. Genevieve had followed his rumored acquisitions for years, the way a sports fan follows their favorite team. He bought with a scholar's eye, not an investor's. He'd once paid a record-breaking sum for a minor landscape by Camille Pissarro, not because it was famous, but because it was the last piece Pissarro painted before his eyesight began to fail, and the brushwork told a story of urgency and fading light. This was a man who understood art not as a commodity, but as a language. The symposium was the next day. An idea wild and terrifying began to form in her mind. What if she went not to meet anyone, not to network, not to prove Marcus wrong, but for herself? To spend a day in a world that had once been her entire universe, to hear people speak the language she loved, to feel for just a few hours like the woman she was before she became a wife. "I'm going out," she told Penny on the phone that night. "A miracle where to, should I get my heels? No. It's something for me." The next day, Genevieve stood before her closet, a place filled with designer dresses and power suits chosen to complement Marcus's image. They felt like costumes for a role she no longer played. At the very back, she found a simple charcoal gray sheath dress, a well-tailored piece she'd bought for her PhD defense years ago. She paired it with low, sensible heels and a simple silver necklace. She didn't look like a billionaire's ex-wife or a socialite. She looked like what she was: a scholar. The symposium was held in the Foundation's private townhouse, a magnificent limestone building off Fifth Avenue. The atmosphere was hushed and academic. No press, no photographers, just the low murmur of intelligent conversation and the scent of old wood and lemon polish. Genevieve felt a wave of anxiety but also a flicker of homecoming. She slipped into a seat at the back of the small auditorium content to be anonymous. The panels were fascinating debates on provenance, the ethics of repatriation, the role of digital archives. For the first time in months, Genevieve wasn't thinking about Marcus or Kinsley or what people thought of her. She was completely absorbed, scribbling notes in a small moleskin notebook. The final speaker was Alistair Finch. He was not what she expected. He was tall and lean, perhaps in his early 50s, with silvering hair at his temples and eyes that seemed to absorb everything around him. He wore a simple dark tweed jacket, no tie. He didn't speak from a podium, but walked slowly across the stage, his voice calm and measured. His talk was brilliant. He spoke of art as a form of data, a repository of human experience, emotion, and history that was more complex and valuable than any digital code. He argued that collectors were not owners, but custodians with a duty to preserve and eventually to share. During the Q&A, a curator from the Guggenheim asked a question about a recently discovered and disputed Modigliani sketch. The expert consensus was that it was a clever fake. Before Finch could answer, Genevieve felt an irresistible pull. Without even thinking, she raised her hand. A moderator, surprised to see a hand from the back row, nodded at her. "Excuse me, Dr. Finch," she began, her voice clearer than she expected. While the craquelure is inconsistent with Modigliani's typical canvas preparation of the period, has anyone analyzed the pigment composition of the underdrawing? His early work in Livorno, before he moved to Paris, often used a specific Sienese umber that was ground with a higher than usual linseed oil content. It creates a very particular chemical signature that would be almost impossible for a forger to replicate unless they were also a materials historian. The room went silent. A few people turned in their seats to look at her. Her analysis was arcane specific and deeply insightful. It was the kind of detail that only someone who had spent hundreds of hours studying the subject would know. Alistair Finch stopped and looked directly at her. His gaze wasn't appraising or dismissive. It was one of genuine intellectual curiosity. A slow smile spread across his face. That he said, his voice resonating through the quiet room, is an extraordinarily astute observation. No, it has not been analyzed in that way. You've just given the Guggenheim's Conservation Department a new line of inquiry. He held her gaze for a moment longer. "Thank you, Reed," she said, her heart hammering. "Genevieve Reed." He nodded slowly. "Ms. Reed, thank you." As the symposium broke for a small reception, Genevieve, flustered by her own boldness, tried to slip out unnoticed. She had done what she came to do. She had remembered who she was. Ms. Reed. She turned. Alistair Finch was standing there, holding 2 glasses of water. He offered one to her. "I was hoping I might have a moment," he said. "Your point about the Sienese umber was not just astute, it was brilliant. That's a level of material knowledge one rarely encounters outside of a restoration lab." "You're a conservator, no?" Genevieve said, taking the glass. "An art historian. Or I was. It's been a while." "Passion like that doesn't just disappear," he said, his eyes kind. "It goes dormant, perhaps. I'd be very interested to hear more about your work. The real work, not the recent hiatus." He said it with such simple, direct respect that Genevieve felt the armor she had built around herself begin to crack. He wasn't looking at her age, her marital status, or her social standing. He was looking at her mind. For the next hour, they stood in a quiet corner of the reception, and for the first time in 20 years, Genevieve talked about art. She talked about the way Gentileschi used chiaroscuro not just for dramatic effect, but as a weapon. She talked about the hidden political allegories in Renaissance portraiture. She forgot where she was. She forgot about Marcus. She forgot that she was supposed to be too old. She was simply Genevieve. And for the first time, she felt that was more than enough. When she finally left the townhouse and stepped out into the evening air, the city looked different. The lights seemed brighter, no longer hostile, but full of promise. She had walked into that building as a ghost, but she was walking out as herself. The days after the symposium were a revelation. Genevieve had expected the encounter with Alistair Finch to be a singular bright spot in her otherwise grey existence. She hadn't expected a follow-up, but 2 days later, a courier delivered a small, flat package to her apartment. Inside was not flowers or champagne, but a first-edition copy of a rare book on the chemical composition of 17th-century pigments. Tucked inside was a handwritten note on heavy cream-colored cardstock. Ms. Reed, your insights have stayed with me. I suspect you might be one of the few people who would appreciate the chapter on Venetian ceruse. If you have the time, I would be honored if you would join me for a private viewing of some pieces that pose similar questions. Sincerely, Alistair Finch. He had included a private number. Genevieve's hand trembled as she held the card. This wasn't a date, not in the traditional sense. It was an invitation into a world she thought was forever closed to her. It was a gesture of profound intellectual respect. She called the number. Their first date was not at a trendy restaurant or a flashy club. He sent a discreet car to pick her up, and it took her not to a public museum, but to a climate-controlled, unmarked warehouse in Queens. Inside was a private gallery that took her breath away. It was a museum of one. Rothko's bled color on one wall, a Giacometti sculpture stood hauntingly in the center of the room, and a triptych by Francis Bacon screamed silently from another. Alistair was waiting for her, dressed in a simple cashmere sweater and slacks. There were no assistants, no curators, just him. I wanted you to see them without distraction, he explained, to hear what they have to say. For 3 hours, they walked and talked. He didn't lecture. He asked questions. He wanted her opinion, her visceral reaction, her academic interpretation. He would stand before a painting, his head tilted, and say, I see the despair here. But you mentioned something about Gentileschi using darkness as a weapon. Do you see that in this soutine? Is the darkness a void, or is it an active presence? Genevieve, who had spent years making small talk about golf handicaps and summering in the Hamptons, felt her mind unfurl like a sail catching wind. She was articulate, passionate, and brilliant. She challenged his interpretations, offered her own, and pointed out details he, the owner, had never noticed. This became their routine. Their courtship was a series of quiet, extraordinary adventures. One day, he flew her on his private jet to Chicago, not for a shopping spree on Michigan Avenue, but to spend 2 hours in a conservation lab at the Art Institute, looking at a newly acquired Degas sculpture under a microscope. Another evening, they didn't go out at all. He came to her apartment, and they sat on her floor, surrounded by her art books, arguing playfully about the influence of Japanese woodblock prints on Van Gogh. He never once mentioned her past, her divorce, or Marcus. It was as if her life had only begun the moment she stood up at that symposium. He was interested in the Genevieve Reed who existed outside of any man's shadow. He was captivated by her mind, her passion, and the quiet strength she was only just rediscovering in herself. "You have an astonishing eye, Genevieve," he told her one evening as they stood before a somber, beautiful portrait by an unknown Flemish master. "It's a gift. To let it lie dormant is a crime against an entire field of study. I didn't think anyone cared about this field anymore," she admitted, her voice soft. "Or about me." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "The world is loud, and it celebrates the wrong things. It celebrates noise over substance, perception over reality. But that doesn't mean substance and reality have lost their value. It just means they're harder to find." He paused, his gaze gentle and infinitely more precious when you do. Meanwhile, Marcus Thorne was living in a very different reality. His life with Kinsley was a whirlwind of public appearances and performative happiness. They were at every opening, every launch party, their photos splashed across gossip sites. Marcus loved it. He felt powerful, desired a king with his young queen. He heard whispers about Genevieve through the grapevine. Robert Sinclair had mentioned seeing her with some academic type. Marcus laughed it off. "Good for her," he told Robert over a game of squash, his voice dripping with condescension. "Glad she's found a friend. Probably some dusty professor. As long as she's happy, right?" He genuinely believed it. He couldn't conceive of a world where Genevieve could find someone who wasn't a pale, pathetic shadow of himself. In his mind, he was the pinnacle. Anyone she found would be a downgrade proof that he had been right to leave her. Kinsley, whose entire worldview was shaped by social media metrics, reinforced his delusion. "Like, who would even date someone that old, for real," she'd said one night while scrolling through her phone. "No offense to Jen, but her like brand is just expired." Marcus had nodded in agreement, basking in the validation. He was so blinded by his own ego that he failed to notice the signs. He didn't notice that the quiet, deferential woman he had divorced was slowly being replaced by a confident, engaged intellectual. He didn't notice because he had never truly seen her in the first place. The turning point came one evening at Alistair's home, a stunning, minimalist townhouse that valued light and space over opulent display. He had commissioned a report on the feasibility of a new global arts foundation, one dedicated to funding material historical research and provenance verification. He handed the thick binder to Genevieve. "I'm thinking of endowing a new foundation," he said simply. "I believe it could change the way we protect and understand art, but a foundation is only as good as the person who leads it." He looked at her directly. "I want you to be its director, Genevieve. I'll provide the capital, you provide the vision. You would have complete autonomy." Genevieve was speechless. It wasn't just a job offer. It was a restoration. It was him handing her the tools to rebuild the part of her life she had been forced to abandon. Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time in a year, they were tears of overwhelming gratitude. "Alistair, you don't have to answer now," he said kindly, "but know that I see you, Genevieve Reed, and I think you are extraordinary." Later that night, as they stood on his terrace overlooking the city, he gently took her hand. It wasn't the possessive grip of Marcus, but a warm, steady presence. "There's another reason I want you to run the foundation," he said, his voice a low murmur against the city's hum. "It would make it much easier to coordinate our schedules, assuming you'd be willing to marry me." Genevieve's heart stopped. It wasn't a grand, dramatic proposal. It was quiet, certain, and utterly sincere. It was a proposal from a man who wanted a partner, not a possession. He wasn't asking for the woman who ran his home, but the woman who would run a global foundation. He was asking for her. She looked at his face, illuminated by the city lights, and saw her future. It wasn't about the money or the status. It was about respect. It was about being seen. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Alistair, I will marry you." They sealed their engagement not with a diamond ring selfie for Instagram, but with a quiet toast of champagne, their conversation turning immediately to the exciting plans for their future and for the foundation. They were a team. Neither of them gave a single thought to Marcus Thorne. But in a different part of the city, the gears of fate were grinding, preparing for a revelation that would shatter one man's carefully constructed world and expose the hollowness at its core. The quiet courtship was over. The storm was about to break. The next week began like any other for Marcus Thorne. He woke up in his sterile, glass-walled penthouse, Kinsley still asleep beside him, her face smushed into a silk pillowcase. He went through his morning routine with the precision of a machine: a cold plunge, a custom-blended protein shake, and a scan of the financial news on his tablet. He was on top of the world, and he knew it. A major deal to develop a new luxury tower on the west side was nearing completion, a deal that would cement his legacy as one of the city's premier developers. He arrived at his office at Thorne Properties, a monument of steel and ego in Midtown, feeling invincible. His assistant, a nervous young woman named Chloe, greeted him with his usual espresso. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne. Your 10 o'clock with the zoning board is confirmed." "Excellent, Chloe. Any fires I need to put out?" he asked, striding toward his corner office. "No, sir. Everything is quiet." But everything was not quiet. Out on the newsstands of New York City, a different kind of story was breaking. It wasn't on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or in the gossip columns of the Post. It was on the cover of Prestige Quarterly, a sophisticated, influential magazine read by the old money and the truly powerful. It was the kind of magazine Marcus desperately wanted to be in, but never was. They favored substance over flash. The cover was a masterpiece of understated elegance. It was a black-and-white photograph shot by a world-renowned photographer. In it, Genevieve Reed was laughing, not a posed, self-conscious laugh, but one of genuine, unadulterated joy. She wasn't wearing a ball gown, but a simple, elegant cashmere sweater. Her hair was loose, and her face, the face of a 45-year-old woman, was luminous. Her hand was resting on the arm of a man who sat beside her, his own expression one of quiet, profound adoration. That man was Alistair Finch. The headline in bold, classic font read, "Silence Broken, the enigmatic Alistair Finch on Love, Art, and the Woman Who Changed Everything," announcing his engagement to scholar Genevieve Reed. The first tremor of Marcus's downfall happened not in his office, but in the elite sports club where his rival Robert Sinclair was having a post-workout breakfast. Sinclair choked on his avocado toast when his associate slid the magazine across the table. His eyes widened first in disbelief, then in pure, unadulterated schadenfreude. He immediately took a photo of the cover with his phone. The text message arrived on Marcus's phone just as he was sitting down for his meeting. It was from Sinclair. No words, just the picture of the magazine cover. Marcus stared at it. His brain couldn't process the image. Genevieve laughing with... He squinted. He didn't recognize the man at first. He looked like some college professor. Then he read the headline. Alistair Finch. The name hit him like a physical blow. Alistair Finch, the reclusive tech god. The man whose net worth was rumored to be in the 12-figure range, a number that made Marcus's own considerable fortune look like pocket change. It wasn't possible. This had to be a joke, a sophisticated prank. Genevieve, his mousy academic ex-wife, who he'd publicly pitied as being too old to date, was engaged to one of the richest, most private, and most respected men on the planet, Mr. Thorne, one of the zoning officials said, looking at him with concern. "Are you all right? You've gone pale." Marcus shook his head, trying to clear the fog of confusion and rage. "Fine," he managed to croak out. "Let's begin." But he couldn't concentrate. The words in the meeting were just noise. His mind was racing, replaying his own arrogant pronouncements at the charity gala. Past her expiration date, a tragedy. He had said it so loudly, so publicly. He had defined her as worthless. And now she was on the cover of Prestige Quarterly, not as a tragic figure, but as the chosen partner of a man who personified value. The news spread through the city's elite circles like wildfire. Phones buzzed from the Upper East Side to Wall Street. The story was irresistible. It wasn't just about the astonishing upgrade in wealth, it was the poetic justice of it all. Everyone had heard Marcus's cruel remarks. Everyone had seen him flaunt his young girlfriend. Now, the tables hadn't just turned, they had been launched into orbit. By the time Marcus returned to his office, the atmosphere had changed. The usual deference from his staff was now tinged with something else, a mixture of shock pity and a morbid curiosity. Chloe couldn't meet his eyes. "Hold all my calls," he barked, slamming his office door shut. He ripped open his laptop and found the article online. It was worse than he could have imagined. It wasn't a simple announcement. It was a beautifully written profile detailing Genevieve's brilliant academic past and her sharp, insightful mind. It quoted Finch extensively. "Genevieve possesses a clarity of thought and a passion for truth that is exceptionally rare," Finch was quoted as saying. "The world is full of people who shout. She is one of the few who knows how to listen, how to see. Marrying her is the most intelligent decision I have ever made." The article went on to announce the formation of the Finch Reed Arts Foundation, with Genevieve Reed named as its inaugural director, endowed with a starting fund of $500 million. Marcus felt the air leave his lungs. Director of a $500 million foundation. He had reduced her to her age, and Alistair Finch had elevated her for her intellect. He hadn't just lost the PR battle, he had been annihilated. He was no longer the successful man who had dumped his aging wife. He was now the idiot who had let a priceless treasure slip through his fingers. He was the punchline. His personal phone rang. It was Kinsley, her voice a panicky squeal. "Marcus, have you seen it? Everyone is texting me. Jessica from my yoga class. She sent me the cover. Is it real? Is your ex-wife really marrying that guy? The guy who owns the internet?" "It's an exaggeration, Kinsley," he snapped, his patience gone. "Well, everyone is talking about it, and they're talking about what you said at the gala. It's super awkward for me now." Her concern wasn't for him, or even for Genevieve. It was for her own social standing, which had been inextricably tied to his. Suddenly, being Marcus Thorne's girlfriend wasn't such a great look. He was no longer the powerful victor, he was the cosmic fool. The final blow came an hour later. It was a call from his lead investor on the West Side Tower project, a conservative old money firm. "Marcus," the man said, his voice cold and distant. "We're seeing some troubling chatter. This public situation with your ex-wife, it's a bad look. It speaks to a certain lack of judgment." "What? It's a personal matter. It has nothing to do with business," Marcus sputtered. "In our world, character is business," the investor replied flatly. "Alistair Finch is on the board of 2 of our parent companies. We can't be in business with a man who is now, for all intents and purposes, a public embarrassment to him. We're invoking the character clause in our contract. We're pulling our funding. The line went dead. Marcus stared at the phone in his hand. The West Side Tower, his legacy project, the deal that was supposed to make him untouchable, was gone. It had evaporated in a single morning, all because of a magazine cover. He had built his empire on perception, and in the blink of an eye, the perception had shifted. He wasn't the shark, he was the chum. He leaned forward and put his head in his hands. The silence of his opulent office suddenly deafening. He had told everyone his ex-wife was a tragedy. He was just now realizing the tragedy was his own. Humiliation is a powerful acid. For Marcus Thorne, it burned through his ego, his reputation, and now his finances. The collapse of the West Side Tower deal sent shockwaves through his company. Thorne Properties was heavily leveraged banking on the success of that project. The public withdrawal of a major investor on a character clause was a signal to every other bank and a partner. Marcus Thorne was a bad bet. Credit lines tightened. Whispers of insolvency started to circulate. His personal life was disintegrating just as quickly. Kinsley, whose allegiance was to status, not to a man, saw the writing on the wall. Their arguments became more frequent and vicious. "This is your fault, Marcus," she'd shrieked during one explosive fight. "You just had to open your big mouth about your ex. You made us a joke. Do you know what it's like to go to brunch and have everyone pity you too?" 2 weeks after the magazine cover dropped, Kinsley was gone. She didn't even say goodbye in person, just a short text message before a moving van quietly emptied her belongings from the penthouse. Her Instagram was scrubbed of all photos of him, replaced by cryptic posts about new beginnings and cutting out toxic energy. Broken and increasingly desperate, Marcus did the one thing he never thought he would do. He tried to contact Genevieve. His first attempts were calls and texts, all of which went unanswered. He then sent a long, rambling email, a pathetic mix of feigned remorse and veiled threats about their shared history. It, too, was met with silence. Finally, he resorted to the unthinkable. He went to her apartment building on the Upper West Side, a place he hadn't been since their lawyers had divided their assets. He buzzed her apartment, his heart pounding with a toxic cocktail of rage and desperation. A voice answered through the intercom, but it wasn't Genevieve's. It was the calm, steady voice of a security professional. "Who is calling for Ms. Reed?" "It's Marcus Thorne. Her ex-husband. I need to speak with her. It's urgent." There was a pause. "Ms. Reed is not accepting visitors. Please leave the premises, Mr. Thorne. Just tell her I'm here. Tell her I need to apologize." He yelled at the small metal box. "If you do not leave, we will be forced to call the police." Defeated, Marcus stumbled back onto the street. He was locked out, not just from her building, but from her life, from the world of respectability he had once commanded. He looked up at her window, imagining her inside, living a life that was now completely inaccessible to him. Did she hate him? Was she enjoying his downfall? The truth was, Genevieve rarely thought of him at all. Her life was full. She was deep in the throes of launching the foundation, recruiting a world-class board, and reviewing grant proposals from scholars around the globe. Her days were a whirlwind of meetings, research, and passionate debate with Alistair, who was not just her fiancé, but her most enthusiastic, intellectual sparring partner. Her happiness was not built on Marcus's ruin. It was built on her own rediscovery. The news of his professional and personal collapse reached her, of course, through Penny. who delivered it with a grim satisfaction. Genevieve felt a distant, detached sadness, the way one might feel hearing about the misfortune of a former colleague from a job long since past. He was a chapter of her life that was now closed, and she had no desire to reread it. One evening, she and Alistair were having a quiet dinner at home. Genevieve brought up Marcus's failed attempts to contact her. He seems to be unraveling, she said, not with malice, but with a clinical sort of observation. Penny said the West Side Tower deal was the final nail in the coffin for his company. Alistair took a sip of his wine, his expression unreadable. The lead investors in that project, the parent firm, is a private equity group called North Star Holdings. They value discretion and character above all else. I'm surprised they acted so quickly based on what was essentially high society gossip, Genevieve mused. Alistair Vaughan set his glass down and looked at her. It wasn't just gossip, Genevieve. I sit on the board of North Star Holdings. Genevieve stared at him, the implications slowly dawning on her. It felt like a puzzle piece clicking into place. Alistair, did you? I made no demands, he said, his voice calm and precise. I never would. Your revenge, if you can call it that, was living a life so full and happy that he became irrelevant. That was your victory, and it was perfect. He paused, choosing his words carefully. However, at our quarterly board meeting, the subject of our portfolio's risk exposure came up. I simply shared my opinion as a board member that any venture associated with a man who displayed such profoundly poor judgment, cruelty, and public instability as Marcus Thorne was, by definition, an unacceptable risk. Character, as I believe they told him, is business. The board agreed. It was a simple, logical business decision. It was the ultimate twist. Marcus's downfall wasn't cosmic karma or bad luck. It was a quiet, clinical, and utterly devastating checkmate executed by a man who operated on a level Marcus couldn't even comprehend. Alistair hadn't acted out of petty revenge for a slight against his fiancée. He had acted as a titan of industry, protecting his investments from the liability of a flawed character. He had used the language Marcus understood, money and power, to pass a sentence that Marcus himself had written with his own cruel words. Genevieve was silent for a long moment, processing the quiet lethality of Alistair's move. He hadn't stooped to Marcus's level. He had simply operated from his own, and in doing so, had erased him from the board. It wasn't an act of passion, it was an act of consequence. She reached across the table and took his hand. "Thank you," she said softly. For what he asked, his eyes searching hers. "For seeing a bad investment and protecting your portfolio," she replied, a small knowing smile playing on her lips. He smiled back, a rare wide grin that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. The ghost of Marcus Thorne had finally been exorcised, not with a shout, but with the quiet closing of a ledger. Weeks later, Penny sent Genevieve a link to a tabloid article. The headline was sensational: bankrupt real estate tycoon Marcus Thorne spotted moving into New Jersey rental. The accompanying photo was grainy, showing a haggard, unshaven Marcus carrying a cardboard box into a modest suburban townhouse. He was alone. Genevieve looked at the picture of the man who had declared her old and worthless. He had chased youth and perception and had lost everything of real value. She had embraced her age, her intellect, her true self, and had gained a world of substance and happiness. She closed the link without a flicker of triumph, only a quiet sense of finality. She turned back to the stack of proposals on her desk, her mind already on the future, a future she was building on her own terms. The narrative was at last hers to write. 6 months later, the Finch Reed Arts Foundation held its inaugural exhibition. The event was not held in a stuffy hotel ballroom, but in a beautifully restored cast-iron building in Chelsea, its industrial bones now housing a state-of-the-art gallery. The air buzzed not with the brittle chatter of social climbers, but with the excited murmur of artists, curators, and academics from around the world. The exhibition, curated and conceived entirely by Genevieve, was titled Palimpsest: The Stories Beneath. It was a stunning collection of works where artists had painted over older canvases or where restoration had revealed hidden histories. At the center of the room, on a simple dais, stood Genevieve Reed. Dressed in a striking deep blue gown that was elegant rather than ostentatious, she radiated a calm, self-possessed authority. She was not Alistair Finch's wife tonight. She was Director Reed, and this was her stage. A palimpsest, she began, her clear voice carrying through the wrapped hall, is a manuscript on which later writing has been superimposed on effaced earlier writing. It is a metaphor for memory, for history, for the truth that what is erased is never truly gone. It remains waiting for a careful eye to uncover it. In the audience, Alistair watched her, his pride a quiet, palpable force. He stood not at the front, but slightly to the side, allowing her the full spotlight. He was not the source of her light. He was simply happy to stand in its warmth. Near the back of the crowd, a familiar face watched with a look of stunned disbelief. It was Robert Sinclair Marcus's old rival. He'd wangled an invitation, because this was now the most important room to be in New York. He remembered Marcus's sneering words at the gala with perfect clarity. Too old to date. A tragedy. He looked at the radiant, brilliant woman commanding the attention of the art world's most powerful figures and felt a chill. Marcus had seen a faded manuscript and tried to burn it. Alistair Finch had seen the same manuscript, recognized its priceless value, and given its author the tools to write her own magnificent new story. The artists featured here teach us that nothing is ever truly finished, Genevieve concluded. We are all layered texts capable of being revised, restored, and reread in a new, more brilliant light. Thank you. The applause was thunderous and genuine. As Genevieve stepped down, she was surrounded by well-wishers. A venerable director from the Louvre congratulated her on her vision. A young, explosive artist whose work she'd championed hugged her with gratitude. After a few minutes, Alistair made his way through the crowd to her side. He didn't say a word, just offered her a glass of champagne, his eyes conveying everything. "You were brilliant," he murmured, for her ears only. "I was me," she said, a smile of pure contentment on her face. It was the simplest and most profound truth. Her past was not erased, but it no longer defined her. It was merely the effaced text beneath a far more interesting story, one whose most exciting chapters were still to be written. In the end, this isn't just a story about revenge. It's a powerful lesson in value. Marcus Thorne believed a woman's worth was tied to her youth and her proximity to a powerful man. He saw Genevieve as an asset whose value had depreciated. What he failed to understand is that things like integrity, intellect, and grace don't have an expiration date. They accrue interest. Genevieve's triumph wasn't marrying a billionaire. That was just the dramatic final act. Her real victory was rediscovering her own worth in a world that tried to tell her she had none. She didn't need a man to save her. She just needed to remember the brilliant woman she was before she ever met Marcus. Her story is a testament to the fact that the best revenge is not stooping to their level, but building a life so magnificent that they are no longer a part of your view. What did you think of Genevieve's incredible journey? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe in the power of rewriting your own story, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more real-life dramas that will leave you thinking.